Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about the first project in a series of studies that my collaborator Lee Fabregar and I have conducted that investigate the various underlying psychological processes by which different properties of a speaker's voice influence persuasion based on how those properties of voice influence our perceptions of speaker confidence. Now in particular, what I'm going to be talking about today are how rate of speech and intonation influence persuasion based on how those properties of voice influence perceptions of confidence when a person is either carefully processing a message or they're not. Now, although a great deal of research has looked at those variables that influence persuasion, one area that hasn't received a great deal of attention are the different properties of a speaker's voice. Now this is somewhat surprising because so much of communication, and of course persuasion, takes place orally. Now we know that beyond the content of what we say, our voice also contains a rich variety of information, so intuitively it makes sense that how we say something should also play a role in how successful we are at persuading others. Now while there are a lot of characteristics of voice that may matter, one characteristic that quite intuitively should affect the persuasion process, and that is also the focus of my talk, is how confident a speaker is perceived to be. Now, in our interactions with other people, it's often fairly easy to tell whether or not they're confident about what they're saying just by listening to how they talk. Some people come across as very hesitant and tentative, whereas others clearly exude confidence. But what is it about our voice that communicates confidence? What's interesting here is that communication researchers have actually looked at this and found that certain characteristics of a speaker's voice reliably vary based on the confidence with which they communicate information. For example, faster speakers are perceived as more confident than those who speak at a slower rate of speed. Louder speakers are perceived as more confident than those who speak quietly. And speakers who use rising intonation at the end of the sentence are perceived as much less confident than speakers who use falling intonation at the end of the sentence. Now unfortunately, comparatively little research has actually looked at how different properties of voice influence persuasion, and those studies that have generally suffer from a variety of different problems. So for example, getting clean, precise manipulations of voice has often been a problem because speakers would be asked to talk either very fast or very slow, or perhaps very confidently or unconfidently, and thus perhaps inadvertently change a variety of different properties of their voice, such as the intensity, the volume, perhaps the pitch, and so confound the manipulation. Now, a second concern is that researchers actually only looked at how rate of speech influences persuasion. So we don't know how different qualities of a speaker's voice influence persuasion, nor do we know whether or not different properties of voice combine to influence persuasion in an additive or perhaps an interactive fashion. And finally, and most importantly for purposes of my talk, even in those studies that have looked at how rate of speech influences persuasion, very little has been done to investigate the underlying psychological processes that might account for these effects. So we first wanted to make sure that these properties of voice actually do have an effect on perceptions of speaker confidence. But beyond that, we wanted to look at the underlying mechanisms by which confidence may influence persuasion. Now, our predictions regarding how confidence influences persuasion are influenced by the elaboration likelihood model. In my talk, I'm only going to focus on two of those mechanisms, but I'd just like to be clear that these are not the only two possible mechanisms that the ELM would predict. What I'm going to be focusing on is when people are engaged in very effortful processing of a message, or they're not. Now, when people are very carefully evaluating a message, what we propose are that different qualities of a speaker's voice, whether it be rate of speech, intonation, or otherwise, can affect our perceptions of speaker confidence. And it's our perceptions of confidence that can in turn then bias our thoughts to be either more or less favorable towards a message. Now, what this implies is that we may not always process things in a very objective manner. So if a speaker sounds very confident, this may lead us to believe that they have something important to say, which in turn can bias our thoughts to be more positive. But of course, if a speaker does not sound very confident, we may either search for weaknesses in their arguments, or perhaps generate counter-arguments, which in turn can bias our thoughts to be more negative towards the message. Now, what this also implies is that we would not necessarily expect the confidence of the speaker to directly influence our attitudes and thus bypass our thoughts. So, what this suggests is that confidence should not function as a peripheral cue when people are engaged in effortful processing of the message. But what is a peripheral cue? Well, when we're not carefully thinking about something, we may use our evaluations of how confident a speaker sounds as a simple cue to directly infer our attitude, and so we would expect a relatively weak effect of speaker confidence on the favorability of our thoughts. Now, we would still expect thought favorability to influence attitudes to some extent, but this should have a relatively weak effect compared with when a person is carefully evaluating a message. So if a person sounds very confident, we're more likely to adopt their attitude, whereas if they sound unconfident, we're more likely to move in the other direction, and that's the idea of a peripheral cue as it applies to vocal confidence. So now that we have some background, this brings us to the goals of our study. Now, our first goal is to more precisely manipulate these different qualities of voice using a digital recording and editing process that allowed us to overcome a lot of the problems in prior research with their manipulations of voice. But more importantly, beyond rate of speech, we wanted to investigate whether other hallmarks of vocal confidence, such as vocal intonation, might influence persuasion, and of course determine the underlying psychological processes that might account for these effects, as well as whether or not these effects occur in an additive or perhaps an interactive fashion. Now, to test these bias and cue effects, what we did was conduct a full factorial design between subjects, crossing high and low elaboration, with a speaker who spoke either at a fast or slow rate of speed, and whose intonation either raised at the end of a sentence or fell. Now, our message was designed to contain arguments of moderate strength, which in fact was confirmed by pretesting. So participants were first assigned to a condition that either promoted high or a low amount of thought. Now, in our high elaboration condition, we wanted to ensure that all participants were both able and motivated to process the message, and so to do that, we minimized all distractions and also told them that this university service plan was going to be implemented at Queen's University the following year. Now, in our low elaboration condition, we of course wanted to reduce both ability and motivation, and so to do that, we gave them an 8-digit number task to hold in memory that distracted them from focusing on the message, and we also told them that Queen's University was not considering implementing this plan. Now, all participants then received the audio passage, followed by providing ratings of the speaker across a variety of dimensions, including, of course, confidence. They then provided a measure of their attitude towards the university service plan, followed by listing and rating the favorability of their thoughts as they applied to this plan. Now, for our rate of speech manipulation, we increased how fast the speaker was talking by 10% relative to their natural baseline rate of speech, and decreased it by 15%. For our intonation manipulation, we chose 10 target sentences and either raised or lowered the intonation of the speaker's voice on the last word in the same sentence. Now, we pre-tested these vocal manipulations to confirm that participants did in fact notice these changes to each vocal property, but more importantly, that these changes were subtle enough so that our manipulations were still perceived as very natural. Now, our core analyses used a multi-sample structural equation model to investigate the different processes by which rate of speech and intonation were predicted to influence attitudes when people were engaged in very effortful processing of a message or they were not. Now, all the direct paths you see here were included when we ran the analyses, but for purposes of clarity, I'm going to remove them from the slides moving forward, because the ELM suggests that these paths should not be significant, and as it turns out, they weren't. So moving forward, we'll focus on only the more directly relevant theoretical paths, which will be represented by unstandardized coefficients. Now, our theory suggests that both rate of speech and intonation should affect perceptions of speaker confidence, both when people are carefully processing a message, as well as when they're not. And that's exactly what we find. However, because our predictions are that people can pick up on these relatively basic changes in a speaker's voice, regardless of how carefully they're thinking, we'd expect the effects of speech rate on confidence across levels of elaboration to be of comparable magnitude, and in fact this is exactly what we found. Now, we would also expect the effects of vocal intonation on perceptions of confidence to be of comparable magnitude across levels of elaboration, and indeed, we find this effect did occur as expected. Now, starting with the top panel, when people are both able and motivated to carefully process a message, our theory suggests that a confident speaker should bias the favorability of our thoughts to be more positive towards the message. So in this case, we would expect a significant positive coefficient to emerge, which in fact did. So moving to the bottom panel, when people are not able or motivated to carefully processing a message, what our theory suggests is that the confidence of the speaker should have a relatively weak or perhaps non-significant effect on the favorability of our thoughts. And as expected, this effect did emerge. And as our theory predicts, confidence should have a significantly more powerful effect on thought favorability when people are carefully thinking compared to when they're not. And indeed, this is exactly what we see. Now, because our theory suggests that this causal chain under high elaboration should be thought-driven, we naturally would expect people's thoughts to have a very powerful effect on their attitudes. And indeed, this is exactly what we find. Now, moving to the bottom panel under low elaboration, we would expect thoughts to still affect attitudes to some degree, which in fact was the case. But importantly, this effect should be significantly weaker than what we find under high elaboration, which is precisely what we find. And finally, when people are carefully thinking, the confidence of the speaker should not directly influence their attitude as a peripheral cue, and so we would expect this effect to be perhaps very weak or even non-significant, which we find. But of course, moving to low elaboration, when people aren't very able or motivated to process what you're saying, they may in turn use the confidence which you convey the information as a simple cue to infer their attitudes. Thus, we would expect this direct path from confidence to attitudes to be significant, which in fact it was. And importantly, this cue effect that we're observing under low elaboration should be significantly more powerful than what we see under high elaboration. And indeed, this is exactly what our data reveal. So these are our final models that illustrate the bias and cue processes that emerge under both high and low levels of thinking. So what these data show are that properties of voice, such as rate of speech and intonation, are having their effects on persuasion based on how they impact our perceptions of speaker confidence. Now, these data also suggest that vocal properties may influence perceived confidence and attitudes in an additive rather than interactive fashion. But most importantly, as our theory predicts, the underlying psychological processes by which confidence influences persuasion differs based on whether a person is carefully processing a message or they're not. Now, one way we're expanding upon this work is by looking at how other properties of voice, such as vocal pitch, influence confidence as well as persuasion, and of course the underlying psychological mechanisms that govern this process. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the ELM suggests several possible roles that vocal confidence could play under different conditions. Now, here we only investigated two of those roles, under both high and low amounts of thought. In other studies, we've looked at how vocal confidence can affect attitudes under more moderate or intermediate levels of thought by affecting the amount of processing. So these are just several of the themes that we're pursuing in our ongoing program of research that investigates how different properties of a speaker's voice can influence the persuasion process. Thank you very much.